Hello 5612 instructor. In this presentation, I will discuss the methods and criteria I used in data collection, my findings, and my interpretations and conclusions that I have drawn. Let's get started. Beginning first with the methods for data collection, I collected data regarding my summative IPA task, which in this case was presentational writing. I collected data for one class of Spanish 2 students, but believe that this is representative for the rest of my learners. Here was the task. Students had to create an original ofrenda and write an accompanying description that explained a little bit about Day of the Dead as well as the person their ofrenda honored. I accompanied this IPA task with the IPA rubric for novice performance of the presentational mode. This was also accompanied with can-do statements. However, it should be noted that there was no formal pre-assessment and the learners were not able to fill out the post-can-do statements themselves. Thus, I attempted to fill out the can-do statements for each learner, but opted not to include them in their final score for reasons I will discuss in the conclusion. However, so you can still see them, these were the can-do statements, as well as the example of the IPA presentational rubric for novice learners. I made no modifications to this rubric. It is as it appears in the IPA manual. Turning now to criteria to demonstrate learning. In order to meet the growth target for this SLO, students were expected to grow one full level. Because we had no formal pre-assessment, all learners were scored at Novice Low 2, and thus were being expected to perform at the Novice Mid 2 level to meet the growth target. Their score was determined based off of the IPA rubric and the accompanying conversion. And I cross-checked this with the ODE Novice Mid descriptors for presentational performance. Thus, if learners demonstrated full evidence of this level, they were classified as Novice Mid 2. If they demonstrated partial evidence, they were Novice Mid 1, and anything above would be Novice Mid 3 or potentially higher. So here was the data about student progress, from pre-assessment through post. As observed in this table, 15 out of 18 learners met the growth target, thus performing at Novice Mid 2 or higher. In total, this would be that 83% of students met the growth target, and in terms of SLO ratings, this would classify as a number 4 or above average growth. Honing in more specifically on pre- and post-assessment data, again, all learners were classified as Novice Low 2 in lieu of formal pre-assessment. And then in post-assessment, 3 learners performed at the Novice Mid 1 level, 8 learners performed at the Novice Mid 2 level, and 7 performed at the Novice Mid 3 level. I will now discuss my interpretations and conclusions of this data. As you can see here, I have reordered the IPA criteria from most to least student growth. I made these classifications based on the individual numbers that each learner scored across these categories. As you can see here, learners experienced a lot of growth with respect to text and frankly wrote really strong complete sentences in their final presentational task. I attribute this success to a strong alignment between the formative tasks that they performed and their summative assessment. Students practiced a lot of presentational writing, and these expectations were made clear. Additionally, I used a lot of functional chunks in instruction that helped students use these memorized phrases. They were heavily scaffolded and modeled. Students also demonstrated a lot of growth with respect to language control, especially regarding the new vocabulary introduced in the WLTU. Students had to list and name and even describe some of the ofrenda items. And with the exception of 2 students who just really didn't complete the task, 16 of the students were able to do this, so everyone who tried. I attribute this success to the fact that this vocabulary was introduced through binding with realia and images, as well as comprehensible input. Additionally, students practiced this vocabulary in a communicative way, and through the negotiation of meaning, further acquired this language. Finally, students demonstrated a lot of growth with respect to comprehensibility, especially the phrases. They showed a lot of success when they named the person their ofrenda honored. This was just briefly refreshed in my unit, but was previously learned. But in order for them to have success, I activated this schema and had them practice in pairs. I believe this formative practice really prepared them for this summative growth. Now I'll discuss how I used assessment to make decisions about teaching. And this starts all the way at the beginning with planning content. Through backwards design, I started with the end in mind. I knew that students would be creating and describing ofrendas, and I planned instructional content in line with this goal and the standards. Thus, throughout the unit, they were scaffolded to be able to prepare it. Specifically, I practiced a lot of presentational writing with respect to the ofrenda and vocabulary. I assessed this mode frequently and intentionally, knowing that it would be part of the summative assessment, and this was especially important with the reduced instruction we had in this year's WLTU. Finally, scaffolding was a big part of assessment and my planning process. It was greatly informed by my work with standards deconstruction, thinking from knowledge through reasoning and skill targets up to creation of their final product. I wanted to support students and help set them up for success. I also used formative assessment to modify instruction in the moment. Although I was not able to have students fill out those can-do statements, I did conduct a brief formative assessment of prior knowledge during my initial instructional conversation. I observed with the open-ended questions that students lacked the target language vocabulary to be able to successfully respond. Thus, I utilized forced choice questioning strategies to help facilitate their language acquisition until they were able to eventually produce more. Additionally, I modified my instruction in light of my first formative assessment, which was my day 1 exit ticket. I noticed that some students were confusing the items of the ofrenda with the Kobe Bryant Memorial. To those specific students, I provided written feedback and then addressed it as a whole class in day 2. Also, as the day went on, I realized the instructions might be slightly confusing. After modifying them slightly, I noticed that more students had success in later periods. Finally, with respect to the Padlet activity, this was done on day 3 as a warm-up, and I noticed that many students could not use coherent sentences, specifically when referring to the practices involved in Day of the Dead. In order to remediate this error, I highlighted strong examples, gave explicit feedback, and modeled. Some students then edited their answers because of the Padlet. They were able to make these changes in real time, but I noticed a significant jump in growth on their final summative assessment. Returning to some of these categories in which students experienced less growth, I'd like to discuss some changes I would make to instruction in light of these findings. They did not have a ton of success with respect to language function, specifically creating with language, and some of their answers lacked details and clarity. Changes I would make would be more explicit instruction involving description, how to describe, what language we use to describe, and what a successful description looks like. An example could be an information gap activity in which students actually described ofrenda elements, thus further preparing them for their summative assessment. Also, in general, more creative use of language and creative formative tasks could have set them up for more success, but there simply was not time in those 3 days for that, and I will just incorporate that going forward. Which brings us to our conclusion, final takeaways from my data and analysis. Overall, I'm really happy with the above average growth displayed through my SLO, especially just with 3 days of instruction. It should be noted that this was only for presentational skills, thus it's not the full range of their growth, but I did observe a lot of success in the other modes of communication in our in-class instruction. However, there are some final factors I would like to consider and improve for next time. Firstly, my can-do statements. In their absence, I realized the key role they play in informing instruction, specifically growth targets, differentiation, etc. In trying to retroactively create my can-do statements, I found some discrepancies between the novice mid can-do provided by ACTFL and the ones I created for my task. This, in combination with the fact that the learners did not fill them out for themselves, made me feel like they were not an accurate representation of student growth and decided to not include them. I will much better align my can-do statements and my tasks going forward. Finally, I also had some outlier students. Some students demonstrated novice mid proficiency without showing any relevant cultural or content knowledge. These students wrote great sentences, but not about the ofrenda or Day of the Dead. My solution to combine content and proficiency would actually be to include genre-specific features in the IPA rubric, which is in line with most recent research on the topic. Finally, some students utilized online resources beyond those allotted, and I think having them handwrite their answers with pencil and paper could be the solution. Thanks so much. That's all. Enjoy your break.